AOC and Bernie Sanders are like the Scottish warriors of the Democratic Party, which is, to say that kings regard them as great to unleash on the enemies, but you never ever put one on the throne if you're an English king.
There's an interesting side-by-side happening on the left right now. As the populist Bernie Sanders rallies Democratic voters in flyover country, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are making headlines with their new book, Abundance, which argues that Democrats need to outcompete Republicans in making major cities flourish. Many of their policy prescriptions won't gel with Bernie's, and that's a normal ideological tension, not entirely unlike what exists on the right. But Trump is the head of the GOP. It's unclear who's leading Democrats right now. Take a listen.
I am curious, whether you think these states are more explicitly pro-market, or whether you think history has evolved differently in these states for totally different reasons.
Yeah, there's a kind of constellation of like ideology and kind of mood affiliation to a bunch of different things, right? So like maybe they don't love corporations, but like they probably are not suspicious of them as a lot of left-leaning people are. And probably what's even stronger is they probably don't like left-wing activists, right? So some environmentalist comes along and says, "Oh my God, protect the the spotted butterfly" or something like that. They're just get out of here. Right? I don't want to hear about this. Right. So yeah, I mean, if you look at like, I think one thing we've learned in like national politics, if you just look at the way Trump and Vance talk, obviously the people who are, the top of the Republican Party now, there's not a lot of love for free markets. I mean, there is a lot of dislike of liberals, and often liberals are the people who are trying to stand in the way of markets. So kind of, by, by default, you get this kind of pro-market position. The balance is probably not the same at the state level. I think at the state level, people are probably, compared to relative to Trump and Vance, more pro-market and less like negatively polarized towards everything else in the world.
After the shutdown that wasn't, and years of a failed strategy to undermine Donald Trump, Democrats need to capitalize on the grassroots energy against Doge. In fact, there's a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin this week, and I'll be there on the ground for it, that is heavily focused on Musk. Democrats are looking to the outcome of this election, for some direction. So which way will they go? Why is this struggle so intractable? Mark Hemingway just finished a long investigation into institutional ideological drift in America's libraries for The Federalist. What stands out to me about that story is how these ideologues are the Democrats' constituency. They're the party's foot soldiers. Can Democrats be a party of abundance and a party that outdoges Doge, or a party that undermines oligarchy by shedding identity politics if so many of their own voters may want to block that? Mark Hemingway joins us now to discuss. Mark, thank you for being here.
Hey, glad to be back.
Have you noticed prices creeping up? I know you've noticed prices creeping up. Groceries, gas, everything's costing more. Tariffs are kicking in, markets are all over the place, and people are wondering, is your retirement built to handle this? Well, that's exactly why we've partnered with Augusta Precious Metals, because when the economy shifts, smart investors look for ways to protect what they've built, and historically gold has done just that, holding its value through inflation, recessions, and even financial crises. A gold IRA lets you own real physical gold inside your retirement account. More investors, especially those with at least $50,000 in retirement savings, are turning to this as a way to hedge against uncertainty. If you're curious about how it works, Augusta Precious Metals put together a free guide that breaks it all down. How gold IRAs work, why they're in demand, and whether they make sense for you. No cost, no catch, just information you can use. Click the link in the description and grab your copy today. All right, let's talk about the left, because they have been wandering in the wilderness for, I'd say, a decade now. Republicans were with them in the wilderness for a while and may indeed return to the wilderness, but since Donald Trump came down the scene, sort of forced the Republican Party to whip itself into shape, Democrats just haven't figured out an answer. In the last couple of weeks, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have struck a chord with some people on the left, saying this is the answer to Trump's hostile takeover. The Democratic Party should become the party of, quote, abundance. That's literally the title of the book, Abundance. And on top of that, you then have Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez promoting the Green New Deal agenda in the heartland, but drawing big big crowds. I guess I shouldn't call Denver the heartland, but they have, Bernie's been drawing pretty big crowds in places like Nebraska and Iowa as well. So with all that table setting, they still seem to be pretty lost, Mark. Am I wrong? What do you make of that?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the most obvious problem here is that they lack a clear leader in any way, shape, or form. Their, congressional leadership is, more or less, heavily dependent on a gerontocracy. It was Nancy Pelosi until very recently, and Chuck Schumer is still running things in the Senate. And so that put forth a really sort of, bad, unreliable image. Just as a matter of image, never mind whether they were actually effective in any way in terms of opposing Trump in both his election and now that Trump has assumed office. So there's no clear formal leadership anywhere in Congress. And so consequently, you see a lot of, backbenchers basically jockeying to make a name for themselves. And now there's a vacuum here. So you have people like Jasmine Crockett, who's, certainly gathered a lot of attention for herself. It's probably beneficial for her career. Unfortunately, I think it's probably overall not beneficial to the Democratic Party that she runs around, insulting handicapped people or whatever it is that she's been doing. And similarly, you've seen a lot of people on the margins of the Democratic Party that, like AOC and Bernie Sanders are the classic example here of, AOC and Bernie Sanders are like the Scottish warriors of the Democratic Party, which is, to say that, English kings regard them as great to unleash on the enemies, but you never ever put one on the throne if you're an English king. And so I think it's fairly obvious at this point in time, an AOC or Bernie Sanders type agenda might have a harder time, winning any sort of, national election or setting the tone for a national political program. Curiously, I think that the Bernie Sanders of 8 years ago might have had that spoke very openly about immigration and other things like that being a problem, would have had much less of an issue. But unfortunately, even Bernie Sanders has, cowed to the mainstream of the Democratic Party on a lot of these issues. So it's really just, an absence of leadership. And, along with that absence of leadership, you mentioned Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book. It's also an absence of intellectual leadership. I think there's a lot to the argument that Derek and Ezra are making, but, for Democrats to become the party of abundance, they also have to become the Democratic Party that, is no longer in favor of an abundance of environmental regulations. And if you look at how states like Oregon and California govern themselves, the constituencies for that stuff are just so out of control. It's unbelievable. And I don't see them reining that in anytime soon. It's possible that 10 years from now, the abundance agenda, might break through. But it's going to require a lot more time in the wilderness before we get to that point.
Well, see, this is what's really interesting because, I'm of two minds about the Bernie AOC barnstorming tour because on the one hand, Matt Taibbi makes a really good point about AOC basically being the identity politics chameleon, somebody who's elected on this hopeful anti-identity, genuine leftist platform and then becomes a queen of identity politics. Bernie Sanders has had a similar trajectory to the point you just made. He's, was anti-identitarian and that hurt him during Clinton's ascent, and then he basically fully embraced that agenda in order to keep ascending in the Democratic Party and keep having power in the Democratic Party. He's now trying to talk a little bit differently about immigration in the sense that almost brings him back to 2016 when he was on with John Carl just in the last week or so. And then on the other hand, there's nothing doji about the left, the genuine democratic socialist left. You will never hear them talk about cutting government fat because they think that's code for cutting entitlements and all of that. So the efficiency abundance agenda is completely, despite the fact that it comes from cultural progressives, completely the opposite of the AOC Bernie ideology, even if Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson believe that you can marry both of them. I just don't know what they're, like you said, there's nobody who sort of marries both camps.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a fundamental tension, I think, between sort of the abundance agenda and the larger sort of cultural program that they're putting forth that nobody is really even trying to reconcile, which is to say that, Trump came along and he basically shattered this sort of, myth, I think that most Americans political observers had, which was that on some deep level, the American people were fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And in reality, it edges in kind of the exact opposite direction, I think, as we've seen with the populist emergent populism. So in that case, I think for the Democrats, the identity politics and stuff would have more weight almost than the economic program. And interestingly enough, as far as Sanders people are concerned, at the Republican convention this summer, and this was long before the election was decided, I had a well-known political reporter tell me that the Bernie Bros had been for some time now, corralling the Democratic leadership and screaming that the trans stuff was killing them. They're the Bernie Bros are the people that actually talk to people in union halls and things like that, and they knew damn well how that stuff was playing, and they had been screaming forever that like this is in danger to the things they actually cared about in terms of a socialist or more left-leaning economic program. They saw the identity politics as undermining that, and the Democratic Party heard all this, and obviously there was a lot of talk after the fact about how effective Trump's they-them ads were and how everyone in the Kamala campaign was paralyzed to even think about coming up with a response. And I don't think that they've come up with an answer for that. So long as identity politics is such a force in the Democratic Party, whatever economic questions they have are going to be something of a sideshow.
Mm. Yeah, and it strikes me, the Chuck Schumer shutdown that wasn't really did energize the base of the Democratic Party, which is different than sort of the general voter, but the base, people actually turned out, got really mad about it. So like your grassroots type Democrat activists were furious. And it's different than 2017. I mean, Mark, you have vivid memories of the resistance of 2017.
Right.
And so
Right.
now it's like, it feels like they've wandered even deeper into the wilderness, because at least then there was unity around this idea of resistance. And now Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries are really hesitant to not overplay their hand, because I think maybe they think they've learned the lessons of lawfare. I don't know. How are you interpreting this?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the answer there is sort of, twofold. One is that they're just dejected. I mean, they have to accept on some level that they lost. The election in 2016 was, much narrower. I mean, Trump barely eked out an electoral college victory and got buried in the popular vote. So they could tell themselves that this was some fluky thing that didn't have any sort of legitimacy. And on top of that, they really genuinely believed that Trump was a puppet of Russia, no matter how absurd it was all along, and all these other things, because they had to rationalize why they lost. Well, this time there are no rationalizations, and further, so many of the narratives that they spun to oppose Trump, things that they were just ridiculous things they were willing to believe, turned out to be untrue. So they have a hard time sort of conjuring up narratives that people are willing to believe and think that are practical to work. I mean, I think we're kind of seeing this in Signalgate right now. We have a situation here where they're just desperate to, and to be clear, I'm not saying wrong things did not happen in Signalgate or am against any sort of consequences for people as a result. But I do think it's this amazing phenomenon on the left right now where they are so desperate to turn this into some sort of all-consuming scandal, and they just lack the horsepower to do it. I'm not sure it deserves to be an all-consuming scandal, even if I think there are consequences, but that's really where they're at. They're so used to being able to drive the conversation, and they just can't do it.
That is so interesting, because it also speaks to the fact that they're now trying to figure out a new path for media. And Mark, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this before, but it seems fairly obvious that the advantage Democrats had in media was at some point going to backfire, because they got so comfortable having basically the New York Times, the Washington Post parrot their press releases with not much criticism, without any of the level of skepticism that's afforded to, a press release, meaning the messaging that's put out by the RNC, DNC, and Democrats and the broader left get much less skepticism from the press. Because they got used to that, they never developed outlets of their own that they could fully control. And so when you see the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos suddenly like putting a more robust direction or ideological direction at the Washington Post, I think the Washington Post still leans really far left, but it also isn't what it was in 2017. And now they want, to have their Joe Rogans back, and they don't. And so they've actually lost some control over the messaging because the right now has outlets that are more powerful than the Washington Post.
Right, right. Like, for instance, the last time I appeared on your show, I went to the gym, and the guy at the gym's front desk, who's a great guy, was like, "Hey, I heard you on, Emily's podcast." I mean,
Shout out.
there is a world where, just a few years ago, I don't think that would have that would have happened. Random people are listening to, a lot of, things that with big audiences that don't have sort of centralized distribution channels. I mean, I think that's really important. So yeah, I mean, I think they're sort of grasping for that, but I think that problem is they're grasping for outlets, right? They're trying to figure out how they can reach the right people, but that problem is almost downstream from their basic problem, which is what is their actual message. It's like that. What was that obnoxious phrase from 15, 20 years ago about the right had, quote, epistemic closure? I mean, it's basically where the Democrats are right now, and it's been heading this way for a long, long time. They were so used to having complete control over the dominant media, that they took full advantage of that to get away with things. But at some point, it actually became sort of a net negative. The Chinese Communist Party has this thing called internal reference publications, which is essentially that this issue in China where the official outlets in China, they're all controlled by the state, pump out so much actual propaganda that Chinese leaders can't rely on them to make decisions. They need their own private publications that have the actual facts so they can go in and make governance decisions. And there is no internal reference publication for the Democratic Party. I mean, they're so used to believing their own, narratives being, read back to them that they're in this place now where they lost an election. They don't understand why. And they have all these constituencies doubling down on the things that made them lose in the first place. It's kind of a real perfect storm of just, ignorance, basically.
And Mark, you've been working on a long piece, sort of mired in this question of who controls America's libraries for the Federalist. And interestingly, this is fascinating for the sort of direction of the left in this conversation we've been having about the politics of the Democratic Party. How much choice do they have but to be woke when these institutions are so deeply affected or so deeply rooted now in an ideology that's taken hold over the course of decades? I don't know if that's where the reporting goes in your Federalist piece, because it hasn't been published as of the time we're recording this. But what do you make of that? I mean, it's not just libraries, but libraries are pretty powerful in and of themselves.
Yeah. So, well, I've been thinking about this for a while, but the impetus for writing this was that the Trump administration is shutting down something called a federal agency. I believe it's called the Institute for Museum and Library Science or something like that. It provides, millions in grants to, local museums and libraries all over the country. And the Trump administration is shutting it down. And it's like, of all the things that you could think to shut down, it's not exactly a huge part of the federal budget, to put it mildly. And everybody, in theory, likes museums and libraries. But when you look deeper at the question, like, for instance, the person they elected to be head of the American Library Association in 2023, just finished a term last year, was a Marxist lesbian. And, it's like that old joke. How do you know if someone's a Marxist lesbian? They'll tell you. And she was, pretty, nakedly saying that she wanted to, wear the American Library Association as a skin suit to further her, sort of radical politics. And, 54% of the 10,000 American librarians that voted in that election voted for this person. So here comes the Trump administration, and, they're looking to cut things. Well, the American Library Association, once upon a time, would have seemed like a very harmless and good thing to support. All of a sudden, it appears quite, comically hostile. And so this is kind of the fundamental problem with where the left is in terms of institutions right now. Like, everybody senses that they have deliberately and targeted these places and taken over them, and it's not good for the country. And frankly, it's not good for America's libraries. I mean, it's not just that the funding is being cut; it's that there are all kinds of disputes all over the country right now involving things going on at local libraries, and this is a whole other issue. Like, I'm as anti-censorship as it gets. I've written tens of thousands of words on how government censorship is bad and wrong, etc. And somehow, Americans librarians have taken that climate of Americans wanting to fight censorship and decided to stake their reputation on making the most explicit sexual material they can, conceive of available to, seventh graders. It's absolutely bizarre that that's where we're at. And
we're
they're
lucky
going
if
to
they're
lose that
seventh
public debate.
graders and not fifth
Right.
graders.
But the point is when these radical politics actually meet the road with ordinary Americans, and the reality is that there's a huge difference between book banning, which isn't really occurring. I haven't seen Americans attacking any printing presses. The most controversial books in school libraries can be bought at Barnes and Noble. But the reality is book banning is a very different question than making finite decisions about finite tax dollars going to support one book over another in a public library. That is a democratic question. And everybody wants to short circuit the democratic questions in terms of how we run public institutions in favor of letting bureaucrats be sort of this unelected clerisy who have total authority over the place. And that is, and what's happening with libraries in that regard is a microcosm of what the Trump administration is trying to do overall in terms of limit bureaucratic control and introduce more democratic accountability.
And yet, I mean, this puts the left in such a... So I'm thinking of the Washington Post again, because it's a fairly good example. The New York Times counts as well. I mean, they've tried to start doing more serious reporting, and that's even an understatement, on things like trans medical treatments for children than they were doing 5+ years ago under this pretense of neutrality and capital S science. But at the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos is clearly unhappy with the direction of the coverage, has clamped down on the editorial line. But it seems to me that, like many other institutions, including libraries, this is an institution that is utterly dominated by people who were conditioned to become culture warriors on behalf of the far left. And Democrats still have to be responsive to that constituency because A, it's a lot of people, and B, they're people who disproportionately control institutions. So it seems to me like the library problem is a problem that is going to steer the Democratic Party, is going to steer the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs and anybody who wants to pursue the abundance agenda. Whichever camp you're in, it seems to me you're going to have to be responsive to this constituency that is an albatross on the Democratic Party's brand.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there's this massive gulf between, say, leadership in all aspects of American life and what the people actually think. And it is, for a long time, I think that it was very easy to sort of, corporate boardrooms, being liberal, or, the heads of bureaucratic agencies being liberal, the heads of the people controlling the the editorial content of newspapers being liberal. It was very easy to ensconce yourself in that world where all these people only talk to each other and convince themselves about what the reality is. But the problem is we saw a whole bunch of issues all of a sudden, I come along, whether it was COVID, whether it was trans stuff, on and on and on, where we saw that the editorial line was further and further away from the people. And until they, find a way to close that gap, like, I don't know what to do. And in the case of things like COVID and the transgender stuff, I mean, the thing that is causing consternation is the actual freaking science, the actual knowledge. It's not a question of whether or not people have differing opinions. I mean, there is a preponderance of evidence at this point in time that, trans ideology is a mimetic thing spread by the internet, and it's ruining children's lives. I mean, there's a lot of actual evidence. European governments have been able to admit that. American governments have not been able to, the American left has not been able to, and American, democratic leaders have not been able to because of political considerations, not because of factual ones.
Yeah, I just, it's almost impossible to imagine one person or even a handful of people, a Hakeem Jeffries, someone on the Senate level, they're now talking about replacing Chuck Schumer. They don't have a bench. I mean, there's nobody in the bullpen warming up. That's my opening day pun. There's nobody there.
Well, yeah, I mean, one way, if I were a Democrat, one way I would look at this is like an actual opportunity for them. They can, this is year zero in a lot of ways, and they can, reset things and try and figure out what their party is about, and put forth an all new message they think will be more appealing. However, like I said, I think they still have that messaging problem. Like, they don't even know where to begin in terms of, what does their party stand for, and do they have an affirmative message that they can all agree on, rather than simply trying to placate a bunch of, special interests that are, completely at odds with each other and certainly at odds with the voters. But these political questions tend to resolve themselves a lot sooner than people can resolve themselves. I should say a lot sooner than you might imagine. All it takes is the right person or the right sort of moment. More fumbling by the Trump administration, and certainly things can change rather quickly. So I wouldn't be completely down in the dumps if I were a Democrat, but I would be working a lot harder at trying to find some sort of agreed upon message, and necessarily forcing it from the top down, so long as it's more aligned with the bottom, if that makes sense. They need to really cut out the middlemen when it comes to determining the message.
Yeah, I mean, the examples of Obama and Trump are good ones. As figureheads who sort of rose and energized the party and actually said, we're steering the ship.
But also people forget, for instance, like how Barack Obama got elected in the first place. He ran as the consummate pragmatist. By the time of his election, by the time of his election in 2008, it was absurd, but people were actually writing pieces about, well, Obama might be good for pro-lifers because he had so successfully convinced people that he was not some sort of radical. He didn't govern that way in the slightest, but he fully understood that being in the middle and being in the mainstream, or perceived as such, was the most important thing for winning over Americans. And there's no question that people looked at this last election and easily decided that Trump was the more crazy as it sounds, the more moderate and less radical of the two people. Kamala Harris had this crazy record in the Senate, and as California AG and senator or whatever that she had to overcome, it was all there on paper. And as much as they can message that, they couldn't message it away.
Mark Hemingway, this was fascinating. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Remember to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for full premium episodes of the show, for an email address to connect with us, and for a weekly newsletter written by me. Really appreciate you all tuning in. Appreciate Mark for being here. If you work at Mark's gym, shout out to you for watching the show. We appreciate it, and we will be back with more Undercurrents soon.